The fluorescent lights in that airport security room felt like they were burning straight through my skin, washing everything in a cold, unforgiving glare. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as officers turned my suitcase inside out, and the sound of their gloves snapping echoed louder than the crowds outside. I remember searching for Evan's face, hoping for reassurance, and instead, seeing him look away like a child caught in the middle of a lie. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that the truth nearly knocked the air out of you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this don't happen to just one person. As the reality sank in, the floor beneath my life shifted for the first time. Let me show you how it all began. The moment I stepped into that security office at Miami International Airport, everything in my world seemed to tilt sideways. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, harsh and cold, and the air smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. I remember standing there, frozen, as an officer told me they had found illegal substances tucked inside my luggage. My luggage. The same bags my new husband and my son had insisted on handling that morning. For a few seconds, I couldn't process anything. It felt like the noise of the airport slipped behind a thick wall, and all I could hear was my own pulse hammering in my ears. I looked toward the doorway, half expecting to see some kind of mistake unraveling. But instead, I caught the expression on my son's face. Evan couldn't even hold my eyes. He lowered his head the moment I searched for him, and that tiny gesture cut deeper than anything the officers had said. Then my thoughts shifted to Michael, my husband of just 3 days. He didn't show panic or confusion. He showed nothing. It was as if he had stepped outside the moment, letting me stand alone in it. And that was when the truth landed in my gut with a weight I could barely breathe through. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a random search gone wrong. My honeymoon, the romantic getaway I had believed in so fully, had been the perfect stage for something planned long before I ever boarded a plane. I knew then that I had to trace back to where this nightmare began, to understand how I walked straight into it without ever seeing the danger. When I think back to that moment in the airport, standing under those brutal lights, I realize it didn't begin there. The real story started months earlier, in a quieter place, long before I understood how vulnerable I really was. After my husband passed away, I spent nearly 8 years building my life around small routines. I worked as a librarian at a community college in Tampa, shelving books, helping students find their way through research papers, and going home to an empty house that felt larger than it needed to be. Grief became a kind of quiet companion, one I didn't fight, but never truly embraced either. Evan came back into my life during that time, moving home after his marriage collapsed. I told myself it was temporary, a soft landing while he found his footing again. Having him around brought a sense of comfort, even though I could feel the tension he carried from his own disappointments. We existed in this strange balance, 2 adults sharing a home, both pretending we were fine while carrying unspoken burdens. I didn't realize how much I missed being seen until the day I met Michael. I was sitting in a small cafe in Lakeland, taking a break after running errands, when he walked in, confident and charming. I felt something stir that I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to believe someone like him could genuinely notice someone like me. Even now, I can remember the warmth that spread through my chest when he struck up a conversation. At the time, it felt innocent, natural. But looking back, I see the hints I ignored, how quickly he wanted to know about my routines, how easily he steered conversations toward my life and finances, how intensely he watched me as if studying a puzzle. I didn't understand then how carefully those pieces were being arranged. But that was the moment everything began, leading me straight into the whirlwind that came next. When Michael slipped into my life, it felt effortless, almost like I had been waiting for someone exactly like him without ever admitting it to myself. He brought a kind of attention I hadn't felt in years, steady, warm, and so carefully tuned to the parts of me that had been lonely for far too long. He remembered small details about my day, showed up with my favorite pastries after work, and created this comforting space where I felt seen again. I didn't realize how quickly I opened up to him, how naturally I let him walk into corners of my life I usually protected. Evan noticed it before I did. He grew quiet whenever Michael was around, watching him with this guarded skepticism that I brushed off as overprotectiveness. I kept telling myself he would adjust, that he just didn't want to see me get hurt again. Deep down, I think I sensed the tension too, but I pushed it aside. I wanted to believe in the possibility of a second chance, something soft and hopeful to break the long stretch of emptiness I had lived with. Looking back, the red flags were subtle but present. Michael's charm felt almost too curated, like he always knew exactly what to say to make me lean toward him. He asked questions about my finances with a casual ease that I took as concern. He nudged me to update small documents, emergency contacts, travel information, routine paperwork, always making it seem helpful, never intrusive. And the way he guided our relationship, moving it forward with such confidence, felt flattering at the time. I didn't see the pattern then. I only saw the promise of happiness. And that hope carried me straight into the trip that would change everything. When we left for Cancun, I remember feeling a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. The sun was barely rising when we headed to the airport, and I kept thinking how lucky I was to have a second chance at happiness. The air smelled like coffee and sunscreen, and everything felt hopeful in that soft, early way that makes you believe good things are finally settling into place. Michael kept a steady hand on my back, guiding me through the crowds, and I let myself lean into the warmth of it. Still, a few things pressed at the edges of my mind. Michael insisted we use a specific set of luggage he had purchased, brushing off my suggestion to use my old bags. He packed everything himself, telling me he wanted to make things easier for me on our honeymoon. At the time, that sounded sweet. Now I hear the precision underneath it. Evan had also seemed unusually tense the day before we left. He hovered around the house, asking vague questions about when we planned to come home, then retreating into himself when I tried to reassure him. I noticed it, but I didn't know how to interpret it. I chose not to. Cancun itself was beautiful. Turquoise water, soft sand, quiet mornings on the balcony. But Michael's behavior shifted. He stepped away often, claiming work calls. He guarded his phone. He pushed certain activities, certain schedules, certain routines that didn't feel like us. I told myself it was newlywed jitters, that I just needed to relax. All of that faded into nothing when I stood in that security office back in Miami, staring at the footage of Michael and Evan placing those packets into my suitcase. My stomach dropped so fast, it felt like the floor disappeared beneath me. The realization hit me with a cold, unmistakable truth. My honeymoon hadn't been a celebration. It had been a setup, and that was only the beginning of what I would soon uncover. I remember sitting in that small interview room, still shaking from what I had seen on the security footage. When an investigator slid a folder across the table toward me, I didn't want to open it. I already felt hollow, like the part of me that believed in my family had been scraped clean. But as he spoke, the pieces of a much bigger picture began to fall into place, and I felt myself slipping into a kind of stunned quiet I couldn't pull myself out of. He told me Michael had done this before. Not once, not twice, multiple times. Each victim was a woman like me, widowed, recently divorced, isolated, or carrying a heavy grief that made them easier to study, easier to win over, easier to use. The pattern was deliberate and methodical. He would move quickly, establish trust, then find a way to exploit their routines, their finances, their relationships. Hearing that made my skin crawl. All that affection he showed me, every tender moment I had replayed in my mind, had been crafted with precision. But nothing prepared me for the part involving Evan. I had held on to this fragile idea that maybe he had been pressured or caught off guard. Instead, the investigator explained that Evan had been in contact with Michael long before I ever met him. Messages, calls, meetings I knew nothing about. He had given Michael information about my schedule, my habits, my vulnerabilities. He had watched the relationship develop, step by step, and never once stopped it. The weight of that truth felt suffocating. I kept seeing him as a little boy again, the one I raised through scraped knees and broken hearts, and I couldn't reconcile that memory with the man who had helped orchestrate my downfall. As the scale of it settled over me, the network, the planning, the cold strategy, I felt something shift inside. The grief was still there, but beneath it, something steadier began to form. I knew I couldn't avoid what came next. I had to face my son. The visiting booth felt colder than I expected. A narrow space filled with stale air and a kind of echo that made every breath feel too loud. When Evan walked in, wearing the detention uniform and avoiding my eyes, something inside me twisted. I had imagined this moment over and over, hoping it would make facing him easier. It didn't. Seeing my son across that plastic divider made the betrayal feel sharper, not softer. I searched his face for the boy I used to know, the one who used to run to me after school or sit beside me on the couch when life was too heavy. Instead, I saw a man carrying shame in the slope of his shoulders. He finally looked up, and in that glance, I felt a wave of grief so deep it almost pushed the air out of my lungs. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes told me everything: guilt, fear, regret. And then he started explaining in the only way someone with no defenses left can through broken honesty. He admitted to his desperation, to the way financial strain had boxed him into corners he didn't want to talk about. He told me how Michael had seemed like an opportunity, someone who understood his situation and offered a way out. He tried to convince himself it wasn't really hurting me, that it was temporary, that he would make it right somehow. Listening to him unravel felt like standing in the middle of a storm with no shelter. I loved him, but the love didn't drown out the truth. As he spoke, something in me shifted. I realized I couldn't carry his choices anymore. I could love him as my son, but I couldn't save him from the consequences he created. That clarity hurt in a way I can barely describe, but it also steadied me. When I stood up to leave, I felt the weight of finality. Our relationship would never be what it was, and for the first time since everything began, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to testify. Walking out of the detention center, I felt hollow, as if the confrontation with Evan had scraped out whatever remained of my old life. But underneath that emptiness, something steadier had begun to form. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was clarity. I realized that if I stayed silent, this network would continue pulling other women into the same trap, and I couldn't live with that. So when the investigators asked if I was willing to testify and work with them, I didn't hesitate. I told myself that if I had already lost so much, I could at least make the loss meaningful. They brought me into a briefing room filled with files, photographs, and timelines spread across a long table. Seeing it all laid out was overwhelming. There were profiles of women just like me, widowed, recently separated, financially stable, or quietly isolated. The patterns were unmistakable. Each woman had been approached by someone with a different name, but the same methods, the same urgency, the same promises. It made my stomach twist to think I had been just another entry in a rotation, a target studied and tracked. The investigators showed me communication logs, planned travel schedules, and notes detailing my habits. They even had projections of when Michael expected to access my accounts, as if my life had been reduced to a timeline on a whiteboard. It was chilling, but it also lit something inside me. For the first time since everything began, I felt a sense of purpose. Testifying wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about stopping the cycle, breaking the pattern they had perfected. As I signed the paperwork and prepared for court, I knew I was stepping into a different version of myself, one who wouldn't be silent again. The courtroom felt colder than any room I had ever stepped into, even though sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the clicking of a pen, seemed magnified. When I took my seat at the witness stand, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. And then, when I finally looked across the room and saw Michael sitting there, calm and unreadable, something inside me tightened. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, but facing him forced me to relive every step he had taken to dismantle my life. Testifying was like peeling back layers of a wound I had tried so hard to hold together. I spoke about the trip, the luggage, the discovery at the airport. I talked about the months leading up to it, the red flags, the subtle manipulations I hadn't understood until it was too late. Each memory felt sharp, but I stayed focused. I owed that to myself and to the other women who never got the chance to speak. Seeing Evan brought in to testify was its own kind of heartbreak. I watched him walk past me without lifting his eyes. When he spoke, I heard the shame in his voice, the way he tried to take responsibility without drowning in it. It hurt, but it also reminded me why I had chosen to fight. The defense tried to twist my narrative, suggesting confusion or exaggeration, but the evidence built itself brick by brick: the files, the messages, the surveillance, the network behind it all. When the verdict was finally delivered, I felt a weight slide off my chest. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it anchored me. Michael was convicted. Evan faced consequences of his own, and as I stepped out of the courthouse into the warm afternoon air, I realized this chapter was closing. What came next would be about rebuilding, about finding a way to move forward and help others who might still be walking toward the same trap I had escaped. In the weeks after the verdict, I felt a quiet emptiness settle around me, the kind that follows a long storm. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like my mind finally had room to breathe after months of fear and disbelief. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of Tampa, a place with sunlit windows and plain walls that felt like a blank page. Every box I unpacked reminded me that I was starting over, piece by piece, on my own terms. At first, even simple routines felt strange. Grocery shopping, paying bills, walking through a place where no one had ever lied to me. It all carried a sense of unfamiliar freedom. But gradually, I began feeling a steadiness returning, a small thread of confidence weaving itself back through my days. I reached out to a support group for women who had survived manipulation and financial exploitation, and meeting others who understood the shame and confusion helped loosen the weight I had been carrying. Their stories mirrored mine in ways that were painful, but strangely comforting. The prosecutors invited me to speak at a training session for new investigators, and standing in front of that room, sharing what had happened to me, I felt something shift. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was someone who could help others recognize the warning signs I once brushed aside. Each time I talked to another survivor or assisted with outreach, I felt my life expanding beyond the damage that had been done. Healing came slowly, but it came. And as I settled into this new chapter, I realized I was beginning to understand what all of this had taught me, something I felt ready to share as I looked toward the final part of my story. Looking back on everything I lived through, I've come to understand that healing isn't a straight line. It bends, it stumbles, and it asks you to rebuild parts of yourself you didn't know were broken. What happened to me changed the way I see trust, but it also reminded me how strong I can be when there's no other choice. I learned that my worth isn't defined by who betrays me, but by how I rise when the ground falls out from beneath me. There were days when the grief felt heavier than the hope, and nights when I questioned every decision I had ever made. But slowly, piece by piece, I found my footing again. And in that process, I realized something I want anyone listening to hear: you can come back from the things that try to break you. You can reclaim your life, even if it looks different than you imagined. If you've ever faced betrayal, or loss, or a moment that made you doubt your own strength, I hope my story reminds you that you're not alone. We're all learning as we go, trying to find our way towards something brighter. Have you ever walked through something that changed the way you see trust or love? Share your story in the comments. I read every one.